Ladies and gentlemen, the 2022 Newsmaker Plenary begins in 5 minutes. Please make your way to your seats.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Newsmaker Plenary will start in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, please make your way to your seats. The plenary session is about to begin.
Welcome to the 2022 Newsmaker Plenary, The Epidemic. Please welcome to the stage Dorothy Tucker, President of NABJ, and Nora Lopez, President of NAHJ.
Good morning, NABJ and NAHJ members. Welcome to our Newsmakers Plenary, The Epidemic. I am, as they said, your NABJ President, Dorothy Tucker.
And I'm your NAHJ President, Nora Lopez. Oh my goodness, mira nomás, all of you here today. We are so happy to finally see each of your faces in person. But as wonderful as it is for us to be here today, we need to acknowledge how difficult these last 3 years have been for us journalists.
From the pandemic to mass shootings, we've covered some of the most difficult stories of our careers. Today's panel discussion will take a deep dive into the impact mass shootings have had on our communities and the coverage.
And here to facilitate the discussion, please welcome today's moderators, Peabody Award-winning NBC national correspondent Antonia Hilton and CBS News Chief National Affairs and Justice correspondent Jeff Pegues.
Good morning. It is good to see all of you here so bright and early. I mean, what time is it? 9 o'clock?
A little after 9, I think now.
9. Yeah, I drank maybe a third of my coffee, so still waking up. But the fact that you're here this morning at NABJ, I think, shows your dedication to the craft. This is obviously a serious topic, but it is one that we as journalists are dealing with, unfortunately,
All the time.
all the time. And we don't have a lot of time today, so we're going to try and get right to the questions, right?
Before we get going, I want to give you a little bit of a run of show. So we're going to bring our wonderful panelists up and have about 50 minutes of discussion, but around that 50-minute mark, you can start heading over to the center of the ballroom here and lining up behind that microphone, because we want about 20, 30 minutes of questions from all of you. And I ask of you two things. First is that you keep those questions tight, concise, so that other people have some time to ask. And then that you make it clear if you want this to be a question that's for the entire group, or if you have a question specifically for one panelist, that's okay too. So without further ado, I think that we should take a look back at some of the very hard work and storytelling that our colleagues have done.
It just keeps happening and nobody does anything about it.
And so, we begin the readout tonight with yet another devastating tragedy that leaves us all, frankly, emotionally spent and exhausted and angry and indescribably sad.
But describing the injuries to these children, what these children looked like when they were brought in, the ones that did not survive.
He talked about these victims being pulverized and near decapitation.
As you know, we're talking about babies, innocent, defenseless children who are simply sent to school that day to learn.
There's a 12-minute gap from when he crashes his truck to when he enters the school. 12 minutes. What happened in that 12 minutes?
We begin with this breaking news from Buffalo, New York. Yet another mass shooting in America.
Tonight, this is a community in mourning. 10 people were killed, 3 injured, 11 of them were black.
Authorities are still investigating, but have made it clear this attack was racially motivated.
The goal of this racist white supremacist shooter was to kill as many black people as possible.
Buffalo, New York, Texas, an elementary school there, a 4th of July parade.
And while these recent events have brought attention to lax gun laws, they have also shed a light on the sheer number of firearms nationwide. According to the ATF, U.S. gun makers produced 11.3 million firearms in 2020. That is almost triple 3.9 million that were produced just 20 years ago.
Please welcome our panelists for the 2022 Newsmaker Plenary. Lester Holt, anchor, NBC Nightly News. Christina Carrega, criminal justice reporter, Capital B News. Eric Deggans, media critic, NPR. Philip Martin, senior investigative reporter, WGBH. Aurelis Hernandez, national correspondent, Washington Post. Erica Simon, anchor reporter, KTRK. Maria Villarreal, national correspondent, ABC News.
All right, thank you all for being here. Why don't we take our seats and get right to the conversation?
I think I want to start today's conversation in Buffalo, New York. And I've been thinking a lot about the rich history of that city and its Black community there that has had deep, deep roots. But also there's a story there of segregation, of disinvestment, and overt racism. And I'd love to go to Lester and Philip first. Bring us into the context of this story, of this city. How do you see the shooting as connected to what we know about Buffalo?
Certainly. You know, we quickly learned, obviously, the motivation there. There was no denying what the intent of the shooter was there because he put it in black and white. The thing that struck me when I got there talking to people was how segregated this neighborhood was, how dependent it was on that grocery store, and that just that sense of vulnerability that was left there and other communities of color across the country, that it's a sense they're coming for us. And that's you know, we had seen that in El Paso a few years earlier, you know, similar manifesto, anti-immigration. But these are, I don't even want to say they're wake-up calls, because we're awake. I think we've been awake before this. We've had, you know, so many trips down this awful road. But this felt very personal for the people of, not only of Buffalo, but for that particular neighborhood, because I think in many ways they already felt cut off and isolated, and now they're suddenly the target of this kind of terror.
Philip, what are your recollections of covering that story in Buffalo?
I'm sorry, that.
What are your recollections about covering that story in Buffalo?
My recollections are, when you think about the shooter, and I'm going to, Lester focused on the city itself. When you think about the shooter also looked at Buffalo. He saw a black city. He looked at an area code, looked for the blackest area with the largest aggregation of people he could think of, where he could basically carry out what were his ideological leanings and trying to turn those ideological leanings into an action. What that action was killing black people, predicated on a belief system that this was the enemy. Blackness was the enemy. It was the enemy. It was, he was militating against black people based on an ideological assumption that black people were somehow taking his place. Buffalo, when you talk about Buffalo is now sits in the pantheon of incidents where individuals cited groups of people believing that those people were replacing them. And this is a key part of this discussion about Buffalo, that it is linked to a larger movement around the world. People were ideologically linked and believing that they are somehow being replaced and choose a target of those who they assume to be replacing them.
We heard a lot of the use of the term lone wolf in the coverage of the Buffalo shooting. When you take all of the history here into account and the current threat of white supremacy and extremism, is that really the right term for reporters to use? Christina, Eric, I'd love to hear what you think of this.
Thank you for that question. It's interesting that they have to use that term when it comes to individualized situations, because you do have to look at every single crime as an individualized place. Even though a lot of the words in what they call the manifesto were repeating from other white supremacists who thought the same thing about the great white replacement. But, you know, in this particular situation, you know, he talked about, you know, the pandemic and having so much time on his hand, his research was being done. So you do have to use the word lone, even though it's a group of people who are thinking the same thing, because the action that he took was very much on his own and there were no other people, there weren't any other threats happening at that moment. So they had to classify it as such.
We've heard, and I've talked about this during our CBS News coverage, law enforcement does not like that term lone wolf because they think it sort of encourages people. And I think to your point, Philip, when you talk about the connection and this theory, when I heard about Buffalo the first time, when it first happened, what popped into my head was the church shooting in Dylan Roof. He's another suspect who came from outside Charleston and specifically targeted that church. Right, so it is something. There is this online community, Maria.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you just kind of hit the nail on the head for Uvalde, which is this online community that people gravitate towards when they don't feel like they have that community within their own city, even within their own family. So they go online and they feel this connection with people, and that's exactly what happened with the shooter in Uvalde. Afterwards, we obviously knew that he was on a number of different social media sites, maybe not the popular ones that we're all aware of, but he was on these sites talking about being so frustrated with his community and people and what he was going to do. But then on the back end, I have to say, not more than 2 weeks ago, I was back in the city speaking to their barista at Starbucks, and she said, oh, we knew that kid. We knew that kid, and we used to tell all the other kids in the city, if you want to be a loser like that kid right there, then you better not, if that's fine, but if not, you should go to school. So it was very apparent that the shooter in Uvalde was ostracized and knew he was bullied and nobody cared, knew that there may have been mental health issues, and nobody really ever tried to help him with them. So yeah, I think that he found solace online, and he found people that were like-minded and willing to encourage him, and nobody reported that. That's what's really tough in that shooting.
What I think is so interesting about this debate about the use of the word lone wolf is the fact that there's so much gun violence in this country that journalists are struggling to separate out the incidents where one person goes to an area and indiscriminately kills people versus an argument that becomes gun violence, or a gang, conflict that becomes violence, or a domestic violence situation that becomes gun violence. Journalists are tasked with going to a situation where, people have been killed maybe minutes after, maybe hours after, and figuring out what exactly happened here. And is it a mass shooting, or is it some other kind of shooting, and how are we going to talk about this? And so I think that's one reason why we see this lone wolf thing come out, because it's just an easy way to say this was not a more common type of gun violence. This was this very specific type of gun violence that we're talking about today. And it also connects to something that has bothered me about coverage. Years and years ago, I talked to this TV news director, and he talked about this thing called the myth of life. This idea that there are certain ways that life is supposed to unfold in certain communities. And if you're in that community and your life is interrupted by violence, and it's not supposed to be interrupted by violence, then that's news. And it leads us to sort of define violence happening in certain other communities where it's more common as not news. and I think that's also something that journalists struggle with, is when you have a mass shooting in a neighborhood or a community that already has to deal with a lot of violence. How do you get people to care about it? How do you get people to stop using that myth of life? Personally, if it was up to me, I would ban the use of the term, this doesn't happen here. Because A, it can happen anywhere. And B, it's encouraging you to think of news as violence that happens in communities where it's not supposed to happen.
Yeah, I think it's, and of course you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think in our coverage, if someone says it doesn't happen here, that's typically coming from somebody who is living in that community. And I think that was part of the problem with Uvalde, is that you had this police force and other people perhaps in leadership in towns like that, smaller towns, who feel like, hey, this happens somewhere else. It's not going to happen here. And as a result, they were caught off guard. And the response was...
That's a diplomatic way to put it.
Well, I'm trying to be diplomatic. But we all know what we saw. Lester, what do you think about the coverage, not only of your network, but all networks out there, cable, broadcast? How are we doing, in your opinion, when it comes to this kind of incident?
Well, I think as was already acknowledged, we suffer from a definition problem as to what's a mass shooting, which ones do we cover. Sometimes I'm asked, well, why do you go to certain shootings and others you don't? And my answer, there's no checklist. There's no moment we go, okay, it fits this, fits that, get on the plane and go. Each has its own unique, dynamics. Shooting at a church, a shooting at a grocery store, a shooting at, a school. And we try to avoid that litmus test of, well, is it common, is it uncommon? But let's face it, these are places that do remind us that we are vulnerable. This notion of can it happen here? Intellectually, we can all answer, well, of course it does, but we don't really live our lives that way. We can't live our lives that way. In the back of our mind, you know, we turn these things on and we see that they're happening, but it still feels isolated because it wasn't in my community on that particular day. And I think that's important for us to capture when we go to these communities, as to that sense of, you know, they know the headlines, they know these things happen, but deep down, no one really is prepared for it.
What's it like for you and all of you when you get on the air immediately after something like Uvalde happens, and we have a certain set of information, and it turns out some of what we've been presented with is very, very wrong? Yeah. How do you handle that with your team and with your viewers?
Well, with our viewers, when I'm doing special reports, the information is trickling in. I remind people that we're going to tell you what we know and what we don't know here, and essentially inviting them to, you know, stay for the long haul. We're going to figure this out together. It's, you know, Uvalde was an interesting case in that I was also in the anchor chair when the Sandy Hook massacre took place. Very similar circumstances. We're on, we have very little information. There's an aerial shot, there's obviously police activity. You know, maybe there's been one person wounded or shot, and then several hours into the coverage, we learned the horror of the numbers. And it was the same thing with Uvalde. And each case, I couldn't speak for a few seconds as I absorbed it, because it was a kick in the gut to me and certainly to our viewers. But I think we have to be honest to viewers that, you know, what we know, what we don't know, and try to, I think speculation is very dangerous when you're dealing with something of that magnitude.
Can I just say, though, I think it's really important to point out, and I think the three of us here probably could attest to that, for the longer form coverage that we've been there for now 2 months, Antonio, you as well, that in Uvalde, though, I saw a very clear cooperation between all of the different networks, papers, social media journalists. For us, I think it was extremely important as journalists, for any media outlet, reputable, that we band together to push for the truth, because that city closed ranks very quickly, and if you weren't of a certain last name or color for that matter even, it was very difficult to get information. And so I thought it was imperative that I didn't care if NBC was right next to me or the San Antonio newspaper for that matter. In that moment, all that mattered was getting answers for the victims and their families. And so, sure, jump in on these interviews, hold people accountable, because I think for us, for the first time covering any of these mass shootings, I felt like the families were really looking to us for help, because they couldn't even get it out of their own community. So that motivated me even more to say, like, what do you got? How can we share this? How can we come together? I mean, I wasn't giving away all the trade secrets, of course, but I felt like you had to in that moment, because there was no other way we were going to pressure them to do the things that they finally did down the road.
Yeah, I think you obviously bring up a good point. I think sometimes with the competitive nature of our business, and I'm sure many of you will agree with this, I got into this business to be sort of a public advocate for the people who can't speak for themselves. You know, speak truth to power, that kind of thing. So I believe that in circumstances like a mass shooting, it's less about the competition and more about delivering a public service. So I understand your point. The complications with Uvalde is the fact that public officials, from the governor on down, were so confident in the early minutes. I mean, their account of what happened seemed so certain. And we're really not used to getting that kind of certainty so early. But obviously, we know what happens now. Do we put too much stock in what public officials say during incidents like that?
You know, that's what I was going to say about this. What's interesting to me, and I may be wrong, but it felt like, you know, we've had mass shootings before that were emergencies that we covered as breaking news, and we understand that there's a picture that everybody thought happened, and it may change according to information that comes out. This felt like the first time where the information was wrong because the public officials were covering for themselves. And we were in a situation where it wasn't people making honest mistakes in a crisis. It was people trying to make themselves look good, knowing that once the full picture came out, people were going to be asking tough questions. Now, I've always said that we trust law enforcement too much. And in incidents like this, we cannot have them even give us a death toll and say, well, that must be the fact. Because we don't know. All we know is what they're telling us, right? When I was a really young reporter, I used to be on the police beat, and you'd get the public information lists of who got arrested and why they got arrested. And we used to run that in the newspaper as aggregate. Now, all that is what the cops said that person did. They haven't been arraigned, they haven't had a trial. Why were we publishing that stuff like it was a fact? But it put the person who was arrested in a position where they almost had to overcome, well, the newspaper says you got arrested for X, Y, and Z, you know what I mean? And this feels like an extension of that. And if anything comes out of Uvalde, I hope it makes us even more cautious about taking these reports that we get from law enforcement in the immediate minutes and hours of a crisis and assuming that it's right, or assuming that if it's wrong, it's an honest mistake, because it might not be.
Adelis and Erica, what do your newsrooms do when sources like law enforcement lie to you?
Well, our newsroom always asks a couple extra questions. And if we're looking at something that just doesn't add up, like in this case, Jeff, you saw me shaking my head because my mom has a saying, she always says, look at what you're looking at. And we realized very quickly, that this isn't adding up. It's not making any sense. And so one thing that was going on in the backdrop that most people know what was going on with Uvalde at the time, you have to think, the NRA convention was coming up there. Governor Abbott was in a heated debate about gun reform, and there were different things going on. And so we knew that. And so we started asking those questions, I would say fairly quickly. ABC, all of us, we started asking very quickly. And so once we realized this absolutely does not pass the smell test, it doesn't make sense, then we really started pushing, and as they said, on the ground, really asking these questions. And as you saw, everything started falling apart. The stories started falling apart. Governor Abbott was just downright wrong. You know, and there was a moment, and it felt very insulting, at least I could say from a journalist standpoint, and obviously to the families in the community, where he said, well, it could have been worse. How? How could it have been worse? You know what I mean? He says he was going off of information coming in at the time, and yes, there's information that's fluid. In the clip that you saw there, what I was doing from the NRA convention, we understand information is coming in early, but as soon as we got that first little hint, we were on it. We were on it because, you know, it was obvious that they were blatantly wrong.
Well, there's something I'd like to point out about Uvalde in particular was that the pieces of information that we got, the first piece was on the Facebook page of the school district. Some kind of lockdown was taking place. I actually was taking my mom to a hair appointment as it was happening and sort of monitoring to see what was happening. But the first sort of official press conference that happened with the governor of Texas. This was a situation, that doesn't happen. It's usually the local police chief or the local mayor or whatever. It was the governor of Texas. And in that exchange, like, that was so unusual that it was being managed from the beginning. And the context, I'm a border reporter for the Washington Post, is that, you know, that region of Texas is awash in Texas state troopers because of the border initiative, security initiative. So this is an area that he knows well. You know, the busing of migrants to Washington, D.C., that meeting happened in Uvalde between the governor of Texas and several local sheriffs and mayors and whatnot. So this was a situation that I think him being re-election, he knows this community because it's sort of a fulcrum of his border security initiative, and wanting to manage it from the beginning set off all kinds of alarm bells. And the fact that DPS, the Department of Public Safety, state troopers in Texas were involved immediately, I think for anyone who knows, who covers, you know, South Texas knows that you have to check everything when it comes out of DPS.
But I wonder, and I have not, you know, being in Washington, I cover Uvalde as closely as many of you have, but I'm wondering, how did they get that so wrong? Did someone brief the governor and sort of blow up the response? Yeah, it was perfect. We went right in there Is that how that happened? How did they get that so wrong?
So we have now learned after the fact. Again, this is also coming from, sources within that are close to the investigation, and you guys can jump in if you've heard something a little different or adjusted, because who knows? You hear so many different things, but I think in the end we learned that the DPS trooper who was very well versed, the police officer who was very well versed in what happened, and was supposed to give the governor a full briefing of what happened. He was the assistant chief who has now been actually put on leave, fainted right as he was getting ready to give the governor this rundown of what happened.
Fainted?
He fainted right in the back room, and he basically could not give the briefing to the governor, but he had his notes. So the second or third command comes in and gives the governor, to some extent, a rundown of what happened, but doesn't know the full extent of it all because he wasn't even in the school, from what we understand. So the governor takes his notes and goes up and says what he says, and obviously it was extremely wrong, but also if you notice, a lot of the people that were standing on that stage with him are either now on leave or in hiding or no longer around, or or have been disciplined. And so it was very clear that everybody up there had a motive, and it wasn't necessarily to get the information out, and they have since been called out for that. But it's very interesting how all of that unraveled. But it took 2 months almost for us to realize how that all went down behind the scenes. And I just heard yesterday that the governor just made a sneak appearance in Uvalde on Monday. It's been 2 months.
I have to ask,
Please.
if this had been a wealthier district, a whiter school district, would the response, would the official story have fallen apart the way that it did?
Hell no.
No.
Philip, sounds like you have something to say about that too.
I was just going to say, on a broader level, you're also dealing with this in the context of disinformation. Disinformation and misinformation is rampant. And Uvalde is an aspect of that. Some of the things that were promulgated online, those things that were said in person, of course a lot of that was wrong because the levels of fact-checking have fallen terribly low for many interested parties. Journalists obviously, are concerned about getting it right. Most journalists, reputable.
Reputable.
But you have quite a few people and quite a few interested parties that aren't. Getting the information out there, making themselves look good, finding the opportunity to look good, to shine, that's important. And I just want to go back for a second, if we can, to the conversation we began with about lone wolves in the context of Buffalo and further back in Texas to El Paso. It's very important that we look at this. The reason that I took a bit of issue with what Eric said about lone wolves is because lone wolves are something else. Lone wolves represent, the Southern Poverty Law Center used the term extrapolating from this whole notion known as independent resistance, leadership resistance, which comes out of the far right-wing sphere of our nation. And using that term initially probably made sense in the reference to Dylan Roof, for example, in Charleston. But the reason the term has become less relevant, or I should say less of a term that we should use, is because we're finding the connections online. Massive collections. These people emulate each other. They write down some of the same information from the same manifestos, and so on and so forth. And it's part of an extremist echo chamber that's going on that threatens our democracy. It threatens, but particularly multiracial democracy. Because because what you're finding are individuals whose stated goal, whether they act individually or they act as organizations like the Patriot Front or the Proud Boys, their larger goal, in fact, is that of creating a white ethno-state. Now, it's hard for us to believe that terms like fascism could be used within mainstream journalism. We always saw that as hyperbole, the notion of creeping fascism. Madeleine Albright, others warned about this years ago. But now we're seeing something that is akin to that. And we see this also connected to gun culture. You cannot connect extremism in this country from extreme gun culture. Those people who are collecting these, whether they're individuals or whether they are part of groups, what they represent is a surge in extremism that threatens democracy. And many of these people view themselves as paramilitaries, not simply as Patriot Front here, National Socialist Club here, Proud Boys here, these disparate groups. They see themselves aggregately as part of a white power movement. And what we're seeing in terms of mass shootings, when those things are explicitly racially motivated and predicated on manifestos and so on and so forth, that's when the term lone wolf becomes less relevant, because you're seeing the connectivity.
Well, I can tell you.
And I wasn't justifying.
Oh, no, I know you weren't. I know you weren't.
I was just explaining.
Right.
I went back to Buffalo for their Juneteenth celebration to get a sense of how the community was doing. And I'll tell you, when it comes to this question of whether that shooter was really alone or not, almost everyone that I talked to there that day told me that they almost didn't come out to the parade because they thought that that would make them sitting ducks for the next person, that perhaps this guy has someone who's going to come up behind him, finish the job. So in their mind, in their psyche, he wasn't alone. There are other people ready to come and finish it behind him. Lester, what responsibility do you think we have as reporters to keep telling the story of that, and also to take a look at and to cover the psychological scars that are left behind in these communities?
I mean, let's face it, it's a form of PTSD. How can it not be? I mean, the community, the safety, the security of your community has been shattered in such a violent way. I think we have a huge responsibility to continue to follow up, on these attacks, how they impact communities, especially in the case, the church shootings we've seen and Buffalo really stand out as stories that deserve follow-up, because ultimately it was not just about the shooting, it was about the place. It was about, as we've talked about, picking out a place, targeting, finding the blackest place that he could to stage the attack. That continues to be a clear and present danger today in virtually every community, certainly every community of color. When is the next one? Whether you want to call him a lone wolf or not, there are people that represent that ideology, and maybe they travel as a single or as a group, but it's still a threat to our security.
Yeah, this is one of those topics that I think we all take to heart. You can be a journalist, but you still have a heart. And when you see school shootings or other mass shootings at a 4th of July parade, these are tough stories to cover. And I also want to say that, the terms lone wolf, I think it's important what we say. I think it's important what we communicate. Because if you look at, these online forums that celebrate these attacks, they use those terms. And there's a reason why they use those terms. Because other people, like-minded people, they see lone wolf as one of those terms, oh, this is cool. Yep. This is cool, I'm gonna do it too. So I think, I wanna start with Christina, but open it up to the panel. And this is sort of piggybacking on your question too. I think about it all the time when I'm covering these stories. Could what I say encourage some other person to do this kind of thing? Mm-hmm. And there is this thing about copycats in law enforcement, and whenever there's one, they're always concerned about the next one. Because you have someone who's watching our coverage, and they go online, and they see the attention that this person gets. How much of a responsibility do we have to say the right thing, to cover the story enough, to talk about the consequences? Christina.
Right, so I want to piggyback off of your visit up to Buffalo. I was up there as well, and I've stayed in touch with a lot of the community members, and there was a person who did a copycat threat to another TOPS location in Buffalo just a few weeks ago. So the idea of the lone wolf, is it really something that we need to stray away from, or is it probably a deflection for the authorities not to look into them as a complete group? Because domestic terrorism is something that needs to be on the books as a crime, and it's not. So that's something that, you know, I think that's why they pretty much will use the term and then it throws them off. But words matter, obviously, even in conversation that we're having right now. And I think it's up to our newsrooms to look at all the words that we are using so that we're not making them, and I don't know what they're thinking, if they think the term is cool or not. I don't even want to be in the mind of a terrorist like that. But if we do have a responsibility in newsrooms to use words differently. Like our newsroom at Capital B, we do not say the shooter's name. We're not going to give you the credence and the stage and the platform to have your legacy, whether you survived the shooting or didn't, have it out there for years to come. It's sad that we do memorialize their names with hashtags just as much as we do with the deaths of Black people who are being killed by police every day in this country. We shouldn't put them on the same pedestal. So I do think it matters that we do not use certain terms, and we do have a responsibility to actually not give them the platform to become the next copycat and to put fear into those communities going forward. But it is something that the Buffalo community is definitely wondering, and they told us this when we were up there, that I hope you don't forget about us. And I want to take note that, you know, we have had several discussions about Uvalde, which is needed. It was 9 days after Buffalo. And I thought the reason why we were hearing such misinformation is because Buffalo, they prided themselves in the 90 seconds it took to take down the shooter. So I think the Uvalde cops felt like, let's jump on that too. We did our, no, you didn't. And it was going to come out, which was foolish on their part, because we all saw the live stream videos of parents outside the school begging to go inside to save their own children. So yes.
Well, what you said, you know, it makes me think, when Uvalde happened, was Buffalo forgotten to some extent?
It was seemingly forgotten, and I think if Kamala Harris did not go up to one of the funerals, would we have covered it? I know that all the funerals weren't covered, like that one funeral was. And it is imperative that we do try to figure out in newsrooms how we can cover more than one tragedy at a time. I know cable news likes to have the 3 top stories of the day to be on repeat 24/7, but we need to be focusing on all the massacres and all the different things that are affecting our communities. And sadly, definitions is the problem, right? Because an active shooter can also be a mass shooter, can also be all the different types of definitions. It's created from the higher ups. Even the definition of a mass shooter for FBI is different from the Gun Violence Archive. It's confusion, it's wordplay, and we as journalists have to figure out in our way how to responsibly tell those stories with these very confusing definitions so that our readers are not confused, so that they can trust us, because we are relying on the police to give us those firsthand accounts, and we have to still roll with it and follow up with it. And it's sad that so that term really bothered me, the myth of life. I've never heard of it before, but the idea that, you know, I'm guilty of also covering police and having to do the cops said and sources said stuff, and then years later you get a call from the person that you put their name in the paper, and they're like, I can't get a job because you put this in here, and the charges were dropped.
Exactly.
You have to finish the story. I think that's all of our responsibility, is to finish the story.
You've gotten that call?
You know, I wanted to speak to something that Jeff said. You know, I know internally at NPR, we talked about limiting how much we were going to say the shooter's name in the case of Uvalde, and we wanted to be careful about how much we talked about that person, because we didn't want to elevate them to the point where it might inspire other people, and we were careful about when do you call something a manifesto or not, and how do you quote from it, and how often do you talk about it. We had those conversations internally, definitely. I hope I'm not speaking out of school. And, you know, one of the things that studies have shown is that assailants who are white get humanized more than assailants who are not white.
Right.
And that's something that we have to be very careful about as journalists. Of course, you want to answer the question of why did this happen? That's the question that everybody has. When somebody goes into a school or goes into a grocery store, or goes into a discotheque and kills a bunch of people, you want to be able to tell people, give people some sense about why that happened. But you have to be careful that you're not talking about, somebody felt aggrieved because, they were under pressure from their job, or they, humanizing them in ways where, if somebody shoots somebody on a street corner over, a personal altercation and they're black, and we just say, well, that person had a history of domestic violence, or that person had a long rap sheet, and we write them off.
Can I also
those are
say
things I know we talk about that at NPR, and that's something that's come up in
Can I also say it's important to make sure they're humanizing the families, the people left behind. I always tell our reporters, we need to bring compassion in our reporter toolkit, that different communities, different circumstances, but these are people, they are grieving, they're hurt. It's the worst day of their life. We parachute in, we take over a city block with satellite dishes, we've got deadlines, we want to hear from families, but we have to take that moment and make sure that we're treating, no matter what neighborhood they're in, treating them with the same respect and dignity at this awful moment in their life. I had in the Highland Park shooting recently, I was going to sit down with a man who lost his wife, and he wanted to talk to me before we went on camera to talk about, are you exploiting me? I mean, these are really good questions. And, and we had to talk it through why we feel it's important to put, stories behind the faces and the numbers. But he really got me thinking about, our aggressive knocking on the doors and get the cell number, and I think we just have to tell those stories, but we have to do it in a way that respects the people that we're covering.
One thing I wanted to ask you guys that cover Uvalde, like at NPR, for example, we even had a discussion about how to say the name of the town.
I was just going to say that, yeah. So for us, I don't think I slept for about 3 or 4 days straight, because people would call or text message and ask, how do you say Usaya? How do you say Cáceres? How do you say, are we supposed to be saying it this way or that way? And there is a way to anglicize certain Spanish names if you can't roll your R's, and I totally get it. And you didn't grow up, rolling your R's. But for me, I got a call from my mama, like, very early on in our coverage, and she said very clearly to me, like, as a journalist of color, as a Hispanic woman, you have an obligation to get their names right. And not just get them right, like, you have to get them perfect.
Yes, mama.
So, and so for me, I made it very clear, and this is a credit also to the people at ABC News, they started to send out emails with phonetics on how to properly say these children's names, and I couldn't have been more happier to see those emails, and I told people, please call me at any time, because I do think that as journalists, yes, we tell the stories, right? But I think also as journalists of color, we have added responsibilities in these moments to go above and beyond what you think you should be doing as a journalist.
I was going to add to that. I think it's, for the younger journalist in the audience, and I remember a long time ago, 30 years ago, being in your seat and hearing information like this. There is nothing more important than getting somebody's name right, because immediately it speaks to your credibility and the name of the city, the town. So it is heartening to hear so many people calling and reaching out to you. And at CBS News, we have a standards department, and every day they send out a list of potential pitfalls that we should avoid. And, obviously local news doesn't always have those resources, but perhaps there's someone in your newsroom who could be that ombudsman, sort of monitoring spellings and the important things that speak immediately to your credibility. Another issue that I think is important for all of us to keep in mind, what you're talking about here is having that kind of diversity in your newsroom. Lester, since you're the quarterback of your team at NBC, how important is it for NBC, as an example, to make sure that the people that you deploy to these communities in some ways reflect the people that they're talking to?
I mean, I think it's huge, and I think everyone acknowledges now. It's part of our DNA at nightly news. Certainly, the things that I can remember being part of discussions at another company I worked for about why is it every black person we see on our air is in handcuffs at the time. Now this is going back into the 90s, but at the time, we had to have those discussions. It had to be this, it wasn't muscle memory. It was, we've got to interview a black physician about this story, or someone of color. Now I think we're at a point now that it is more organic in our organization. I think many organizations right now that we don't have to stop and think about it, like and keep a tally. It's just what we do.
Yeah, I think, what was it, 2 years ago, George Floyd, I think that was a real turning point in terms of emphasizing diversity in newsrooms across America. Anybody who wants to respond?
Well, I mean, I was interested in your guys' experience because I think our experience in Uvalde was that Latinos pronounced the name of the city one way, and then white folks pronounced it another way. And we were trying to figure out, like, which community are we dealing with and how do we reflect? And it seemed like there was a cultural divide in covering the story that didn't get talked about a lot. And so I was kind of interested in hearing about that from you guys. If you experienced that, how did you negotiate that?
Well, so my name, I have a difficult name to pronounce for some. It's Arelis and Arelis. And I'm Puerto Rican from DC, but I'm living in South Texas for a while. There are special pronunciations for everything. So good journalistic practice, just ask the locals how it is they say their town name or how it is they say their names. Uvalde, Uvalde. Both work.
Sometimes the locals aren't quite sure too.
I don't know, Uvalde, Uvalde. That's what I've heard from both.
My mama would say Uvalde.
Uvalde.
I mean, I say Uvalde, but when you phonetically put it on a piece of paper, it does look like Uvalde, like you. But
I'm wondering, does that hint at a cultural divide that's deeper when it comes to covering the actual shooting and how the police responded and their attempt to cover things up and all of that,
So I would say, we talked about this, I think, on an email at one point, like the shooter for Uvalde didn't go there with a with race motivation, right? But I think on the back end, how that community was responded to was racially motivated. This is a poor brown community, and they were treated like poor brown people, plain and simple.
Yeah.
So I think for me, growing up also in a poor brown community as well, and seeing a very clear divide between the diverse parts of my community and the white parts of my community, I think that's what we were seeing a lot, and we still are in Uvalde. I think that there is a very clear divide, and that divide now is seeping into everything from how the victims are being treated, what sort of treatments they've gotten so far, who sits on the school board, who doesn't, who's making these decisions. And so, again, while it wasn't racially motivated, the shooting in and of itself, I do believe on the back end, how they're being treated now is very, race has played a huge part right now in that.
Well, and there's historical context too. Like, any part of South Texas has sort of a uniqueness about it. There's nothing sort of the same all along the border. And in this particular strip of South Texas, there is very much a divide between the majority Hispanic population, Mexican American, Tejano population, and the power structure for the most part being white dominated. And that's certainly true in Uvalde. That's not true everywhere in the border region, but it's certainly true in this particular place. And there's a reason why Governor Abbott had his meeting about deporting or sending migrants on buses to Washington, D.C. These are communities that have large ranches that are largely owned by people not of color, that are the economic drivers in some cases of these communities and have a far greater say in the way things are run in those communities than the people who have their children in the schools.
It's funny, even in the English language, learning which community is named correctly, we had that issue in Buffalo. The community itself is Cold Springs on Google Maps, but the community called it Cold Spring, right? So, and then the census called it Cold Springs as well, but then you Google somewhere else, it was Cold Spring. It's just, you have to ask the people. And even the one woman Reverend Halt, who was very kind to be with me the whole time I was out there, she was like, you know what? I think we should just call it Cold Springs because I've been here for 70 years. So you're right, it is very important to be on the ground, talk to the people, figure it out, because even our Google Maps are incorrect too, so.
Well, it's almost time for us to turn it to the audience, but I have to ask one question of all of you. You know, we're talking about this responsibility that we have to get the facts, to get the pronunciation right, to reflect this community back in the right way. And a lot of that responsibility falls on our shoulders, Black and brown people in newsrooms. And while that is a responsibility that we all are proud of, it adds another layer to work that frankly we're not compensated for. And I just want to check in on how all of you are doing after years or decades in some cases of covering these stories. How are you as people and as reporters?
It's rough. You know, anybody who knows me well knows that a story like this with Uvalde, they have to call me immediately and ask, am I okay? I mean, me personally, and I'm very transparent on social media and the different things that I struggle with. Yes, I'm a journalist, but I wear many other hats as well. This particular story just was a trigger for me. I really suffered after my daughter was born 3 years ago with some postpartum anxious thoughts, like, is she okay? Is she well? Is she, like, all these things about her well-being, and then here you have children who literally were not taken care of. Things were dropped, they were not taken care of. So it took me to a place where I was literally crying all day as I'm trying to identify the names of the victims as they're coming in. And I'm having to wipe my face and go on the air, and wipe my face, then go on the air. And it's mentally tough, it's draining. And, you know, the compassion part, I always try to have that in my stories because this is real life, you know. That's why, you know, I'm like, these are babies. These are parents and families who are heartbroken, they're devastated. And you feel their pain, and it sucks a lot of energy out of me. I'm very much an empathetic, compassionate person. Like, I'm one of those who, I have to go and hug the people. I have to go and pray with the people, you know. So it's a blessing and a curse to have that, you know, but it sucks so much. So, you know, we talk obviously a lot about self-care, and we know that there's resources available. I gotta take them. Because it's a lot, it's heavy, and unfortunately, this keeps happening over and over and over and over again, and I don't really think we ever really get used to it, right? I think it's the immediate, it's here we go again, and then you feel just a plethora of emotions. There's numbness, there's anger, there's frustration, there's sadness. So I don't really know if I've ever, you know, in my 15-year television career, mastered that. I mean, we get the job done, we're professionals, right? We get it done every time, but it's difficult. You know, and you have to have a support system when you go home and you cry, and you go home and you need to be quiet or whatever the case. So I think it's just being real with yourself, where you struggle, and for me, like I said, trigger points, and handling that as it comes. And being okay with sometimes saying, not okay today.
Yeah. You know what's weird? Being a TV critic, you know, I'm not usually on the front lines of these stories, but I remember when 9/11 happened, and I happened to be a TV critic then. And I remember after 5 hours of watching continuous coverage of 3,000 people's lives getting erased, that was like traumatizing. Mm-hmm. And that was a revelation for me to realize that. And so I realized that there are times when even when you're covering a story at a distance, you get traumatized by it, and you have to realize that it's happening, and then you have to figure out a way to sort of handle that, you know. Process that. Otherwise, it will come up in weird ways if you just try to keep going. So even when you're not necessarily on the front lines of covering these stories, you can be traumatized by them, and you should be aware of that and learn how to sort of pace yourself and maybe take a break, or you know, don't watch the continuous coverage. I'm always telling people, don't put CNN or MSNBC or Fox News on the background in your office, because you're traumatizing yourself without even realizing it, because so much of that coverage is based on conflict.
You know, it's okay to shed a tear, and I've shed them, you know, covering these kinds of stories, to feel that humanity. It's very easy. We get the call right now, there's been a mass shooting somewhere, and then the machine gets turned on, the machine that gets people to airports and crews there, and who do we have to interview, who have we booked? It's almost, if you're not careful, it becomes rote. But you have to remember each story is different. And I've fallen into that, like another school shooting. I know exactly how it's going to play out. I know what our lead package is going to look like. I know, the gun control people are going to be on, and we can't fall into that. These are huge personal stories for those that we cover, and we have to sometimes make sure that we're feeling and make sure that we're hurting and that we're shedding a few tears and that, we still have the ability to be shocked and saddened.
I share those tears, Lester.
One second, Philip. I want to just let everyone know that now, if you have a question for folks up here, is the time to make your way to the microphone right here at the front, and then you finish up. I just wanted people to start moving.
Right, absolutely.
So they get their chance.
No, those tears are important. I was on a Zoom call with our staff one day right after Buffalo. I couldn't, it was it, that flood. I cover extremism. And for months, I've been watching this surge of hatred in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Buffalo. And then you saw, though there was no clear ideological connection, to see the picture of these children, these babies in Uvalde, that was extraordinary. And I decided to take time off. I'm taking 4 months off starting in September. I'm doing a Shorenstein Fellowship at Harvard. Now, obviously, it's not an easy topic I'll be focused on, but it's not the day-to-day. I'll be looking at the pushback against this hatred and this extremism that we're seeing across the country.
I've also, while we're confessing here, I have been quite public about my severe anxiety that was developed as a result of covering a lot of violence. You think, and I think a lot of police officers are like this too, you think you get used to it, but you don't. And it sort of festers. And even this breaking news mentality, I'm looking at your phone, okay, I gotta go. I developed this severe anxiety where I recall a breaking news story and I could not talk. I could not talk. So it got that bad, and it is something that, as I said, I've acknowledged and I've worked through. And what I found is that you have to turn it off. You have to take a break. And I still love what I do, and it's what I will continue to do. But you have to have balance in your life. And you can't be afraid to talk about your true feelings, because we're all feeling it. What we are reflecting in the news is a spate of violence. It could be shootings in Chicago or mass shootings. It's all bad news. And if you've lost someone recently, a child, a family member, a death in the news can sometimes trigger you. And you should be sensitive to that. And last thing, another reason that I'm proud of the strides that CBS News has made. Now I've noticed that there are emails about counseling available after mass shootings, and I think that's important. And I don't think anybody should feel bad about reaching out and talking to someone, because I remember about 10 years ago, a much more experienced journalist at CBS News, there was an active shooter situation. And I was like, come on, let's go. And he's like, I can't do this. And, I looked at him like, what is your problem? But then I learned what the problem is. It catches up to you. It catches up to you, and it happened to me.
May I say real quick, we don't get enough credit as journalists, and I'm so glad you lumped us into the categories of those first responders, because we're not seen as first responders by the government, and we should be. We're relied on to know what's going on around the corner, down the block, or up the street, across the pond, and yet we're not seen or given those credits as a first responder. That's something I think that we should really gather together, NABJ, NAHJ, all the other journalism organizations, and really think about getting legislation on the table to get somebody to get us on that list of being first responders, because we should be considered that.
I would agree, yeah.
Speaking of which, after our audience Q&A, there are other sessions, there are mental health resources available here at NABJ, NAHJ. Please check your schedule and take advantage of those resources and opportunities. I think it's so important, but also just check in on each other as we're all hanging out and having fun over the next couple days. You know, all of us have covered these tough stories. Just check in on your friends. Step up to the mic. We'd love to hear what questions you have for us.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so my name is Dara, and I'm from the south side of Chicago. And when we talk about Uvalde, I think Governor Abbott had said, "What about the people in Chicago?" You know, and personally for me, it's like, do you all feel that my city is always being scapegoated when it comes to gun violence? Because yes, both issues are issues of access to guns and gun violence, but we all know Black people killing each other in urban areas has a 400-year problem than white people feeling inadequate about themselves. So do you all feel that Black people on the south side of Chicago, especially when it comes to mass shootings, especially what happened in Highland, Illinois, because you know Highland, Illinois is where Michael Jordan used to live, it's the Home Alone house, you know, and always being, since Chicago is right there, always being us being scapegoated when it comes to gun violence in this country. How do you all feel in general how groups of people, especially Black people on the south side of Chicago, like myself, are always being scapegoated for something at a bigger issue here? Thank you.
When Highland Park happened, I tweeted, please stop calling it Chicago. Like, it's not the
Because
same
it's
city, right? I was insulted, I'm not even from there. But also it's frustrating when you see the numbers when it comes to gun violence. Chicago seems to always topple the list. And it's like, but there's other things going on in Chicago that are to combat that. I was in Chicago a few weeks ago. There was a lot of organizations that were talking about what you're saying. It is a frustration in the community. I do think we need to do a better job of actually covering Chicago as a whole instead of always lumping you guys into the gun violence and like saying, look at how they're doing it. Every weekend is a massacre. Like, and again, it goes back to those definitions. And the problem isn't being addressed. It's just being shipped to the side and seen as, oh, that's their problem. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And I'm frustrated for you.
Well, it's Baltimore. You know, Baltimore is one of those cities,
Baltimore,
and that's, you know, one of my favorite cities is Baltimore. And I'm always keeping an eye on what people in the newsroom are writing about Baltimore because, you know, like Chicago, where I was last week, there's so many incredible things going on in these cities, and we sort of stamp them in certain areas of those cities with this black mark, so to speak. And it is unfair in a lot of ways, and the positive doesn't always get covered.
You know, I was going to say one of the reasons why I think this is happening is that Chicago has been used in these political discussions. Conservatives in particular have been pointing to Chicago. And, you know, we always hear about, you know, black on black crime. And I keep saying, well, you know, that's crime. Because when you look at the statistics, people victimize the people who are around them, and because we're such a segregated society, that means most crime is the same race. You know, people tend to kill people who are the same race as them, because those are the people that they live around. So this whole idea of sort of black on black crime and talking about Chicago in that context, you'll see it all over Fox News, you'll see it all over Breitbart, you'll see it all over these conservative websites and media outlets. And it's a distraction, and it's ill-informed. And it winds up creating this picture of the city that, again, encourages people to say, well, that's a violent community, so when violence happens there, it's less notable than if it happens in a community where we're not used to hearing about that kind of violence. And that is when solutions stop happening.
And when people say, what about Chicago in conservative Texas, I say, well, what about it? Let's talk about it. Let's break it down then. Let's talk about the jungle environment that was created. Let's talk about the systemic issues. Let's break it down, because as he said, that's absolutely the scapegoat. It's easy, right? Well, you got to clean up this first before you can talk about anything else. No, this is structurally different. There are various factors that play into some of that violence. And so usually that's my response. I mean, you know, respectfully, but it's what about it? And then we go from there, because it's not just simply Chicago's plagued with violence. So, and I'm sorry that you feel like that. I know that's rough to be in that position.
It's like, that's what I was
I hate
when
that,
he said it. And I was like, well, we've had 400 years of issues to deal with, so.
That's right, that's right.
I want to bring up our next questioner, just because we have a lot of folks in that line. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of you, but I want to make sure we get some more voices in. Thank you.
Thanks. We put all the Chicago people at the front of the lines. Very nice.
Right.
My question voices. There are a lot of people that have platforms. Some of them are spreading the kind of misinformation and hate speech that contributes to some of the problems that we're talking about. So what do each of you feel is your personal obligation and responsibility when you hear someone on a national platform promoting replacement theory?
I think there's nothing more important than facts. Of getting facts and data out in the public sphere, but in a large-scale surge. Basically, misinformation and disinformation have to be countered with facts. And I must say that over the years, journalists have done, I think, a much better job than they're credited with in terms of countering disinformation as it happens. I mean, it could be, and I'm going to talk to the TV critic about that, but as it happens, I mean, I think it's important. When you hear someone talk about what is being euphemistically described as the big lie, that is to say that Donald Trump won this election, which is nonsense, and that's counterposed by facts and data and court decisions, and so on and so forth. But you found journalists basically countering that in the same graph. That wasn't always true. It was, at one point, that was seen as that's their frame. And that frame was legitimized because that was another point of view, if you will, as opposed to a fact. But factually, I mean, I think it's, again, I think it's most important to counter these things with facts and data. That's not going to convince everyone. And we're way past convincing everyone. It's just not going to happen. That's the type of society we live in, because some people simply listen and view and read that news which they find they're comfortable with, whether it be Breitbart, as Eric pointed to, or Newsmax, or Fox.
Alex Jones.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if you've watched that trial.
Tucker Carlson. I mean, I know there might be some people working for Fox here, but I'm sorry. The network is responsible for an extraordinary amount of disinformation. And it's important for us to counter that as it happens.
I would add to that also, you know, in Texas, we talked about the governor quite a bit right now. I mean, he spouts all sorts of stuff about immigration that is far from the truth, as probably all of us can attest to here. But fighting with him on social media platforms is just dumb. It's a waste of our time, honestly, right. Because people are going to go look for what they want to see and what they want to read. I think for us at ABC News, you know, for us it's consistency. We've committed to Uvalde 365, which is a project that will follow this community from beginning to end. We don't always do that, especially on a national platform. I don't think we have the time, especially in the news cycle that we are in. But this was too important for our network, so we committed to Uvalde 365. And I think the consistency as a journalist, it's not always easy, but being able to go back and continually hammer people with facts and check yourself and go back to those same sources that you talked to on the day one or day two, I think that's what matters most, and it's a huge way to combat a lot of the disinformation that's being put out there by one side or the other, for that matter.
But is that really enough at a time when there are people on YouTube and Twitch and all of these platforms who have audiences that rival Lester's audience on nightly news? I mean, and they are not beholden to any of the rules and processes that we go through, and they have people who think that that's news, or at least think that that's truth. I mean, are we basically talking to ourselves?
I think it goes back to the fact that, like, you're not going to convince everybody out there. And until we realize that as journalists, like, our job isn't necessarily to convince people one way or another that Uvalde did or didn't happen. It's to tell people the consistent facts as we learn them on a day-to-day basis, and then allow viewers, allow customers to make their own decisions one way or another.
And our responsibility to fairness, we should always remind ourselves, does not mean we give an open platform, an open mic
Agreed.
to all comers. We have to exercise editorial responsibility when this idea of giving balanced views doesn't mean everybody gets a
But I think we're in a unique situation where we have an audience that has been propagandized for decades. When people who watch Fox News have been propagandized for a long time to get to the point where they're believing Tucker Carlson when he talks about replacement theory. And in mainstream media, we have not figured out how to deal with that. Our model is we find out the facts, we verify the facts, we tell you the facts, and you make your own decision. But when you tell those facts to people who've been watching some of these media outlets for decades, they reject them. And when you have enough people in America rejecting facts, that is a problem for us. We have not grappled with that. One of the things we tried to do is that old truth sandwich thing where you say what the lie is, or you say the truth, then you say what the lie is, and you say the truth. We've come up with these Band-Aid approaches to try and minimize the amount of misinformation that we're passing along in our reporting. But it's hard for us to face the fact that there might be a huge chunk of our audience, 30 or 40% of people, who believe, for example, that Donald Trump won the election. When you have 30 or 40% of a country that believes that, despite all of the evidence that's out there, that is a threat to democracy.
Yeah,
and how are we dealing with it?
We do have to ask the next question, but the poll numbers are showing that even President Trump is losing support. And I think finally some people are waking up to the facts. And that is the number that I see that shows, okay, they know this is not true, and this is not true, and that's not true. Thank you for your question. It was another good one. Who's next?
Hi there. Claudia Grisales. I'm with National Public Radio, work with Eric. I'm actually originally from Chicago too, so I'm keeping up the trend. I grew up in Texas, however, and although Congress is my full-time beat, the Uvalde story really struck me, so I traveled a couple of times down there to cover it. I wanted to go back to the debate of pronouncing the name. What happened to me is I had done a hit on a show, and I was asked to retract to pronounce it as Uvalde. That was the original pronunciation we started out with, and I refused. I said, no, there's multiple ways to say it, so I didn't, and I did a bunch of research, started calling around in the community, getting the different pronunciations. We had this huge newsroom debate about it, and the story I shared was that I had learned is that the community was named for a Spanish-born Mexican governor, Juan de Ugalde, with a G, not a V. And so it was misspelled. It goes back to the history of misspellings in that state of different Spanish words, and maybe touches on racism as well. But it also taught me a lesson, and for NPR, we got to this place after this debate of, no, it can be pronounced Uvalde, 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 all those ways. That's okay. That's part of us understanding that community, all of its different flavors and colors, and it just taught me a lesson of how important it is to learn who these communities are, what their history is, their trials and tribulations before we parachute in, to make sure we respect and honor those who were hurt along the way and are able to tell their stories more fully. So I'll take a seat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you weren't the only person. There were other correspondents who were pushing the network to deal with that issue.
Thank
you. So it was a great debate, and I think we came out of it stronger as an institution because of it.
Good morning, Mario Boone, former local TV news reporter, paroled to the dark side of communications, and loving it. Thank you guys so much for doing this panel. It's been very informative. I had the unfortunate experience to cover the aftermath of Sandy Hook. And truthfully, it never goes away. I can still see and visualize very clearly the faces of some of the parents I talked to. And you do take it home with you, like Erica said. But one of the things that I found in that coverage is the news management from my former station. We went into overdrive trying to protect the viewers in terms of what we showed them. And I thought then, and I still believe we do a disservice by not giving people the truth about what mass shootings do to people, what shootings in general do to people. And what I mean by that is people don't get to see or hear or learn the true damage that a person's body suffers when they are shot with an AR-15. And I wonder if you guys think we need to pull back the curtain a little bit, or maybe completely, and really give people a look at the damage that is caused by an AR-15 assault weapon. Are we ready to do that? Is it time to really give people an inside look, and maybe attitudes will begin to shift? And I also will leave you with this. You talked about not trusting what the police say, and I truly believe that. And I will remind everyone that if we had listened to the cops in Minneapolis, to this day, George Floyd would still be dead from a medical condition. So that's very good advice. You cannot trust what they tell you in the first narrative. Thank you very much.
There was a congressional hearing a couple of days after the Uvalde shooting, and they asked the medical examiner to explain and describe the damage to the bodies, and he refused to answer. I haven't seen it. I've heard what the descriptions of the children's bodies were left behind. I don't know if the viewers would want to drink that over their morning coffee, as some editors would say, but I think there's something in it when everybody needs to have that Emmett Till moment and see the damage of violence, and I think it might be helpful and to give the viewers the option to see it, give a disclaimer or something, click this to view graphic, if you want to see it, but then it becomes a ongoing PTSD moment for the people that were closely affected by it, the families. Like, I don't know if I would want everybody in the world to see my 4-year-old or child or even the adults that were murdered in Buffalo. I heard about how graphic that grocery store floors were left after that incident. So I don't know if we would want that.
Yeah, I can't say I haven't thought about it.
Yeah.
We have the television camera is a very powerful instrument. I do a broadcast program, and we warn viewers generally before something graphic. But let's face it, the time from warning to seeing the graphic footage sometimes can be 5 or 6 seconds. I did happen, when I was covering Uvalde, to interview one of the emergency physicians who was treating some of the victims at a San Antonio hospital, and he did describe, the nature of the wounds. My feeling was, I get it. I don't necessarily need to see the picture, but I think it's a question we need to keep revisiting in certain circumstances. You call it an Emmett Till moment. I think that's an appropriate way to look at it. For some stories, it's a conversation we should be having.
I think the thing to keep in mind, though, was that Emmett Till's mother was able to make that decision.
Of course.
Yeah. And I think what we saw when the video came out of the cops in the school in Uvalde, and you could hear, you couldn't see anything, but you could hear the shots, you could hear screaming, and a lot of families were upset about that. And I think that's going to keep us from being able to do very much of that.
At the same time, I think with the permission of the parents, can you imagine what would happen if the nation was able to see what an AR-15 did to a child? One of the things I inherited from my mom was the original copy of Jet magazine, Emmett Till's death.
Yeah.
I have shown this to nieces, nephews, godchildren, everyone. The photo of Emmett Till in this magazine, because it had a major impact on me as a child. It influenced my thinking, my philosophy, my reporting. To look into this magazine, it was covered at the time by Jet magazine, and see the body of a child beaten to death by grown men, anchored down, thrown into a river. Those things had a major impact on me. Can you imagine a nation that is inured to mass shootings, seeing and having a cyclical argument all the time about guns and mental violence? I mean, whether or not the individual was mentally ill, and whether or not this was simply episodic. I've heard, but of course it happens, and it happens, and it happens again. What would happen if we had a moment that we've never had before, where you actually see the body, especially that of a child, torn by these bullets? The nation would be traumatized. Perhaps that trauma is good in order for us to reach a different conclusion. Journalistically, it crosses into a whole different territory. It really does. But it's really worth thinking about the impact that it might have, if you will, as a public service.
Thank you, Philip. I would love to keep discussing this. I think all of 9 of us could sit here probably for the next 3 hours, but unfortunately we have to let people go to the many other events happening today. I can only speak for myself, but I'll hang out for a few minutes here if anyone wants to come by, ask questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to everyone here, but really what I want to say is thank you to everyone who took time to be a part of this discussion. I know it's early in the morning to talk about something so challenging, so I just want to remind again that there are mental health resources and events here, and that there are so many people here and friends who we should lean on and reach out to process all of this.
And before we go, I want to thank our leader who put this program together and some of the other people in the cast that helped make this a reality. Boynisha Barnes is the producer, Jarvis Murphy, the editor, Brandon Pope, the announcer. Thank you all for a job well done, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you to our amazing panelists, yes.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
You guys did a great job.
That was
a wonderful job. I didn't mean to say that you.
Oh, what's that?
The Culture, powered by NBC, is next in this very room.